This week on Act Out, the purge is here. Facebook, Twitter, and the silencing of anything that goes against the state. Next up, women's health and rights are under attack. A backwards theocratic reworking of Title X threatens women's already dwindling rights over our bodies and our life choices. Finally, women's march on the Pentagon, challenging militarization at home and abroad. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. I know his flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. By now you may already know that last Thursday, Facebook purged more than 800 accounts and pages, accusing them of, quote, working to mislead others about who they are and what they're doing, claiming that the purged accounts, quote, have consistently broken our rules against spam and coordinated inauthentic behavior. What the fuck does that mean, you might ask? Well, apparently, inauthentic behavior means using, quote, sensational political content regardless of its political slant to build an audience and drive traffic to their websites. So I guess you mean publishing controversial or even just plainly political content, which is what these pages did. Included on this list were pages you might be familiar with: the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media, Police the Police, Filming Cops, Cop Block, and RT correspondent Rachel Blevins. These pages were well known for posting content that questioned and called out the system in much the same way that we do on this show. From more issue-specific pages dealing with police brutality to broader pages that covered the system as a whole, this purge clearly had nothing to do with, quote, inauthentic behavior, and everything to do with authentic behavior that chafed Facebook's new fact-checker army, which consists of the Weekly Standard, a neocon magazine, as well as the Digital Forensics Lab, an arm of the Atlantic Council think tank, also a neoconservative group funded by Gulf monarchies and defense giants like Raytheon. With fact-checkers that publish shit like this, I am surprised that the only things left on Facebook aren't just the Proud Boys and sexy Pocahontas Halloween ads. As of the taping of this show, there is no indication that the years of work and millions of followers can be restored. And many of these pages that lost Facebook access also lost Twitter access. I am not being hyperbolic when I say that the fascist push to silence dissent is here. Nothing against the state, as Mussolini once said. And while I don't really enjoy the I told you so thing, I'd like to harken back to that episode way back in early September, episode 175, when we covered the then recent blanket banning of all things Alex Jones. I pointed out then that this was just the beginning. That it doesn't matter how you feel about the bloated pus-stain Alex Jones, it's about recognizing what that ban meant. Now it might be clearer. And while many progressive and radical pages still exist on Facebook, it's past the time, and then some, that we look to other platforms to organize. For a recap of this conversation and ideas to move forward, check out episode 175 and support the purged outlets by visiting their sites directly. We'll link to an article that lists several of them at the end of the show. Moving on, women's health, emotional, mental, and physical, has been a topic of much discussion recently, and for good reason. Sexual assault isn't just a physical trauma, and you probably didn't need a study to tell you, but a recent one points out that depression, anxiety, poor sleep, and high blood pressure are all common consequences of sexual harassment and assault. But it's not just in the realm of unwanted sexual advances where women are struggling to get care. Title X is a $280 million federally funded program that, among many other things, provides birth control for low-income women without health insurance. Title X also funds wellness exams, cervical and breast exams, testing and treatment for STDs, and contraception education. Important to note, it does not provide federal funds for abortions. Still though, contraception education and the proliferation of birth control are more than enough to irk the religious right. Because if women have those, their sacred missionary position as broodmares of the state is threatened. Enter the Protect Life Rule, a new set of regulations that would only support clinics whose sole form of pregnancy prevention are fertility planning methods that rely on women tracking their periods and refraining from sex at certain particularly fertile times of their menstrual cycle. So, clinics that provide abortion services or birth control, from patches to pills to condoms, would be exempt from receiving federal funds under Title X. To put that another way, Title X birth control programs prevent 1 million unintended pregnancies a year. The proposed changes to Title X would leave those women and more in the already growing expanse of reproductive health deserts, instead suggesting that they opt for a combination of abstinence and detailed record keeping, what the religious yahoos like to call natural family planning. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the rhythm method, aka the least effective form of birth control, if you can even really call it birth control. It hinges on the woman's ovulation cycle, the idea being that in order to avoid pregnancy, don't have sex when the woman is most fertile. So, first off, goodbye spontaneous afternoon sex. Secondly, and more importantly, this method is built on the fembot fallacy that women ovulate at the same time every month, like a fucking kitchen egg timer. But spoiler alert, most of us don't. Most women don't ovulate or have their periods at the exact same time or for the same duration every month. The ones that do, incidentally, are typically on birth control. But remember, we're not doing that because Jesus. So those who want to use this method are told to leave a buffer, sometimes of up to 10 days, so as to be on the safe side in avoiding pregnancy. I mean, back in the day when you only had a choice between goat intestine condoms and abstinence, I can see why women would have chosen to abstain from vaginal sex for an extra 10 days, all the while rejoicing that much like condoms, sex toys have a rich and very long history. Pun intended. But we don't live in ancient Greece or Rome or the 1700s. We live in a time when women can have access to a wide array of birth control that allows them to decide how, when, and if they'd like to use their bodies for childbearing. But again, that doesn't really work with the theocratic regime platform of women being broodmares for the state. Separation of church and state? Sorry, not familiar. Meanwhile, as more and more actual clinics close their doors due to absurd regulations and pointed religious zealotry, businesses like Obria are flourishing. Obria Medical Clinics recently launched a $240 million marketing campaign to bring women into their brainwashing, family planning clinics. In a grotesque form of irony that is clearly lost on the shitwits running the show, Obria maintains that their goal is to give women choice. Because right now, the only choice they have is to go to a place like Planned Parenthood. You know, that awful place that provides everything from breast cancer and cervical cancer screenings to, as their name suggests, family planning advice. A whole whopping 3% of what they do is provide abortions. This is kind of like saying that you really don't like that the only place that you can borrow a book is the public library. Why isn't there another place that only lends out the Bible and strongly worded pamphlets on how masturbating will make you go blind? Truly, we are a stunted society in our lack of choice. And speaking of Planned Parenthood, you may recall the case from a couple of years ago where anti-abortion activists cut together a shitty video which tried to frame the organization for making bank off of selling aborted baby parts. The ploy then backfired when the man behind the videos, David DeLayden, was indicted for tampering with government documents, a felony, and so, ironically, the purchase and sale of human organs, a misdemeanor. Fast forward to today, and guess who's on Obria's National Advisory Board? Amateur film editor and full of shit sexist bigoted asshat, David DeLayden. He's really moved on and up since the days of being publicly shamed for a laughable attempt at post-production. Who else is on this National Advisory Board, soon to be flooded with federal funds for governing women's lives and bodies? Oh, you know, a couple of bishops from the Catholic Church. And why not? Assaulting and raping children is one way of abstaining from consensual sex with an adult woman that could possibly lead to pregnancy. And of course, the Catholic Church, or really just Christianity in general, of which 7 of the 12 Obria Advisory Board members list an affiliation to in their bios, has a long history of lying to and oppressing women. Death by stoning, rape, Gang rape, selling into slavery, sex trafficking, all sacred practices in that old book of Christian mythology. So how does that look when guiding a company marketed as a women's reproductive health clinic? Well, here's a little taste. On their website, Obria notes that they do not perform abortion procedures. They say that several times. They also repeatedly note that an abortion is not a risk-free procedure, while also being sure to list all the risks and side effects that almost never happen. And don't just take my word for it. After all, I'm just one out of many women who's had a totally safe abortion. Indeed, 1 in 3 American women will have an abortion by the age of 45. It is one of the safest and most common medical procedures performed in the United States. In fact, a 2014 study showed that having an abortion is actually safer than having dental surgeries. And it's way safer than actually having kids. This year, America's Health Rankings reports that maternal mortality is now at a rate of 20.7 per 100,000 births. Guess what abortion is at? 1. As Huffington Post noted last year, the risk of death from an injection of penicillin is 2 per 100,000. To suggest to women, then, that abortions are life-threatening while encouraging them to give birth is like telling someone they may get hit by a bus if they stand at the bus stop and then encouraging them to stand in the middle of fucking traffic. These zealotry centers, because I refuse to call them clinics, are sending women with little to no understanding of their reproductive health towards motherhood, or at the very least full-term pregnancy, with nothing but well wishes and a handbook on how to be a good and obedient wife. And of course, as anyone who's swirled this around in the mental blender more than once knows, it's hugely illogical that a group so against abortions is also so against birth control and contraceptive education. Because guess what statistically, factually, real world and not some god or goblin bullshit produces less abortions than telling horny people to abstain? Birth control. Furthermore, in the irony department, as most religious right-wingers also worship the almighty dollar, there's the fact that contraception programs save money. As Cammie Joffrey, CEO of the Women's Health and Family Planning Association of Texas, noted in a recent interview, we know that every dollar we spend on Title X saves $7 across other government programs, including Medicaid. We avert Medicaid births very frequently by getting contraception for clients and preventing unplanned pregnancies. But if you ask Obria, birth control is bad because it's not effective. Oh, and also diseases. Yeah, according to Obria, using an IUD could lead to pelvic inflammatory disease, or PID, which is funny because upon further research, it turns out that, according to the CDC, the leading cause of PID is untreated STDs, which you get from not using protection. But while Obria peddles lies to predominantly poor and marginalized women, actual clinics continue to close, and more places like Obria are opening. Something we could see a lot more of come these Title X changes. So ultimately, there are 2 big problems here. 1, education, information. The fact that girls and women could get pregnant without ever even understanding how it happened or how it could have been prevented is fucking disgusting. The fact that then they'd be led into a place that tells them that they'll likely bleed out if they have an abortion is equally disgusting. Because the very sad truth of the matter is, and here's the other big problem, abortions won't ever end. And botched abortions with coat hangers will cause hemorrhaging. Women desperately drinking bleach and Drano will cause serious medical emergencies. Women have and will continue to take charge of our bodies in whatever ways we can, even if that means hurting or even killing ourselves to do so. Our job as community members, regardless of gender, is to first off ensure the spread of scientifically backed information. This is something we can do immediately. If you see a place like Obria opening up in your town, hand out flyers on the sidewalk outside with clearly noted information about contraception and abortion. Host meetups where teens and above can come to learn about the reproductive health and birth control options available. Protect and support the clinics that provide not only abortions, but all reproductive health services. And no, that does not mean the ones who preach the rhythm method and getting down on your knees for a misogynist fairy tale villain. This state-sponsored religious extremist oppression of women and our bodies is something that affects everyone. Because if we live under a theocratic fascist state, so do you. Finally, today we sit down with Emma Lee Fiala, organizer for the Women's March on the Pentagon, the upcoming event happening here in D.C., and via solidarity actions across the country that hopes to reignite the anti-war and anti-militarization work by bringing together people and issues that fall under the very wide net of our military-industrial complex. Take a look. So, Women's March on the Pentagon. Why specifically Women's March on the Pentagon?
There's a few different reasons for that. The first being it's kind of in direct response to the recent women's marches that have gained a lot of traction and been fairly popular, and most people have heard of those women's marches. Cindy Sheehan, our creator, approached those folks when they were first starting, and she wanted to address the war issue, since that's something that affects women significantly. And she was basically told that that's not their thing. It's just not their issue, which didn't make her happy. It didn't make a lot of people happy. So, part of the reason that's in our name is in response to the absence of war in that movement. Um, but that also leads into the other fact that it was brought up because war adversely affects women at far greater rates than it does men. And that fact is basically glossed over all the time. So we want to highlight that and bring attention back to that. And also, there's just kind of a historical precedent for a peaceful woman led anti war movement. So we want to do that too. And it doesn't mean men can't come. It doesn't mean men aren't involved. We have men involved with every aspect except for being on the core planning committee. That's women led, but it doesn't mean men can't come.
Right. So you mentioned that a war affects women more adversely than men. Talk a little bit about some of those effects.
Yeah. So basically anything that you can think of that might go wrong because of war, that might be some effect of war, it just affects women more. There are more female refugees, and typically they are mothers, so they also have kids with them. So that makes the whole idea of being a refugee that much harder when you're caring for other people too. There are more casualties of women. There are, if you think about what just the presence of the military in general, not necessarily actual combat happening. There's US bases and bases for other countries throughout the world, and there's a higher rate of problems with sex trafficking near them, higher rates of rape near bases, and everything like that affects women more. And also, when soldiers come back to the United States after having been in combat, there's a greater chance that there might be some sort of physical domestic abuse happening in the homes once they return. So that's another way that it affects women. It's kind of, there's countless examples, really. It's very significant, and there should be a lot more attention on it than there is.
So with that, with the attention being brought, why did all of you organizing feel that now was the time to do this?
Well, it should have been, it should be now, or it should have been every day up until now. It's one of those things that once people start banding together around this idea, you know that it has to be now. You can't wait, because this is an ongoing issue and it just keeps getting worse. One of the big things that happened was that the anti-war movement fell asleep during Obama's presidency. And that was a long time that happened. There was outrage about war prior to that, and then people thought that they got their candidate into office who was going to tackle these things, and then they just ignored it. It wasn't their issue as much as they thought it was. So then once he didn't do anything, they just kept believing in him and went along with it. So then a lot of those people went to sleep. And a lot of those people would have stayed asleep had Hillary been elected too. And a benefit to having a Trump administration right now, even though there's tons of problems and everything's going wrong, is that there is outrage about some of these things again. So it's kind of it's a good time to try to bring this back and put it in front of people again, because because of what his administration is doing, it's a little bit easier to reach people who are also outraged about all of these other things that are happening at the same time.
So I'm curious with the concept of war, what exactly that encompasses, because you have the aspect of foreign wars, which we're involved in a lot, far more than are talked about, and by proxy, even a larger number. But then there's also the issue of militarization here at home, be that the militarization of the borders or the militarization of the police. Is that
Mhm.
something that you're also focusing on, or is this strictly the foreign aspect?
Because we are an imperialist country, and the march, we are anti-war, but we're anti-imperialist above that, because that imperialism has more reaches than just the war machine does. And that can be seen in a bunch of issues here at home, including, like you mentioned, the militarization of police. Because if they were not receiving things from the military, they wouldn't be militarized. That goes hand in hand. But also, even outside of getting those actual things from the military, the fact that our country is so pro-military and involved in wars everywhere, that influences our culture. I believe that we've become a lot more violent because of that. That it's maybe not something that is in the forefront of people's minds all the time, but it's something that people are more okay with than they like to realize, because it's part of who we are. It's been part of who we are since our country came into existence.
How do you feel that a good way of going about this is, because obviously there's the march, but obviously changing paradigms is
Yes.
a longer game than an
Mhm.
afternoon. So what do you feel are some of the ways that you can start addressing this pro-military
Mhm.
paradigm?
Yep. So we are hoping that after October 20th and 21st, that we become a bit more of a movement than just a simple, like, we marched one time, because marches are great and they can get a lot of attention on something, but once they're over, they're over. And we see that all the time. There's marches for everything these days, and once they are over, people felt like they did something and nothing changes. So that's not our goal. We hope that change will come from this. That the march itself and the rally is in an effort to get this back in front of activists, and then it's kind of like a trickle down thing. We get activists thinking about it again, and we get people fired up about this issue, and then they can bring it back to their each individual issues and put it back in front of just everyday people, and get it talked about again. And attack it in whatever way is kind of most applicable for individual people to get involved, whether that's becoming more aware of their family enlisting in the military or being in support of the military and discussing it that way. Fighting back about where our taxes go, getting people involved potentially in local politics or wider politics, but we know that politics is not the answer. So we really want to highlight the fact that the issue of war is bipartisan. So we can't vote our way out of this. We're going to have to tackle it from other directions. But the first step is to get it back in front of people again, so we can kind of decide where to go from there. Um, and also, one thing that we're doing on Monday, it's a new plan we have now. The march, we have workshops happening on Saturday. The march and the rally is happening on Sunday, and then on Monday we're doing something called civil assistance instead of civil resistance. We're going to head out into DC and feed the homeless. Even small acts like that will snowball over time, and if people become more interested in doing things that are like civil assistance or civil resistance or whatever they want to do, over time we will be able to make more of a change after our march and rally.
So talk a little bit about the layout for things. You mentioned workshops. Like what kind of workshops are we talking about?
We have 3 workshops planned so far. The first one is called Civil Resistance 101. So we'll be learning about civil resistance for people who haven't done that before and want to know a little bit more, and also talk about the history of it. A lot of people don't know necessarily times that it's been used most effectively. And then we'll have another workshop that is called Victims No More, and that is basic self defense. There's an organization in Chicago that we're working on called Fury, and they will be putting that on for us. They do that in Chicago often. So I think they're just kind of taking that general package over to us in DC so we can learn about that, as well as a workshop about alternative and independent media, because we have a lot of alternative and independent media folks involved in the march and coming to the march and speaking at the rally. So I'm excited about that one because that's what I work in. So we'll talk a lot about how to support independent media, why it's important, and the idea of propaganda that's coming out of the government and the country right now, and why we need to fight back against that. I'm hoping that we can add in a few more too and really use that time, because a lot of people will be there early on Saturday, and a lot of people have a lot of great skills and things to share. So why not maximize our time and learn some of those things that we can take away to turn this more into a movement that we can do things back at home and do things with our own organizations or our neighbors or whatever, as opposed to just leaving this there at the rally and march.
For more information on the Women's March on the Pentagon, visit marchonpentagon.com. If you can make it to DC, remember there are workshops happening on Saturday the 20th and the march is Sunday the 21st. I will be performing at the rally post-march, and for a complete list of speakers and performers, check out that website. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Please spread and share this with all of your friends, foes, and people that you don't know. Again, check out that last slide and the show description to find sites mentioned in this week's show. And for interim updates, as well as posted videos, images, and articles, visit us on social media. But to really make sure that you get this content, sign up for our newsletter so you get these doses of dissent delivered to your inbox. Progressive voices are being silenced on corporate social media, and this direct contact format is the best way to stay informed, engaged, and acting out. And to those who have donated, thank you so much. Please keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Sometimes we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got no